Good evening. Here's your Brian Uncle again. Now, I have another story for you, but I'm also having a cup of coffee in my favourite mug, all the way from ta-da, India. Bear with me now. And a biscuit, because I love biscuits. Okay, here we go. This one is called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You might know of this story. It was made into a Walt Disney film, also called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Do you know what a dwarf is? A dwarf is a very short person. It can be an adult, right? And they don't really grow very big. They only get to maybe the size of maybe Bapidas, that size. But they're an adult, they might be 25, 35, 45, 50 years old, but they don't grow anymore. So they're called dwarfs. Anyway, once upon a time in the middle of winter, when the flakes snow fell like feathers from the sky, a queen sat by her window in an ebony frame and sewed. She was sewing and watching the snow fall. She pricked her finger on the needle, and 3 drops of blood dropped onto the snow. And because the crimson looked so beautiful on the white snow, she thought, oh, that I had a child with skin as white as snow. She obviously wasn't from India. Lips as red as blood, and hair as black as the wood of this ebony frame. Well, she could have been Indian with the black hair. Some time later, she had a little daughter whose skin was as white as snow, whose lips were as red as blood, and whose hair was as black as ebony. She named the child Snow White, but afterwards the queen died. A year had gone by, and the king took another wife. She was a handsome lady, but proud and haughty, haughty, and jealous of anyone who might be more beautiful. She had a wonderful mirror, and whenever she looked at herself in it, she said, little glass upon the wall, who is the fairest of us all? The mirror replied, because they have talking mirrors, you see there. Lady Queen, so grand and tall, you are the fairest of them all. She was satisfied, for she knew the mirror always told the truth. Do you want to see her? You want to have a little look? See what she looks like? There she is, looking at herself in the mirror and saying, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? So she knew anyway this mirror always told the truth. As time passed, the little child named Snow White grew even taller and fairer, and at last she was as beautiful as the day and more beautiful than the queen herself. So once the queen asked the mirror, little glass upon the wall, who's the fairest of them all? It answered, Lady Queen, you are tall and grand, but Snow White is the fairest in the land. Give me a break till I have some more coffee. And a biscuit. I love biscuits. Do you have those biscuits in India? They're called fig rolls. Very nice with figs inside them. Right, here we are again. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. Little glass upon the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the mirror answered, Lady Queen, you are tall and grand, but Snow White is the fairest in the land. The queen was startled. She turned green with envy. From that hour she burned the secret wrath wherever she saw Snow White. So she was very angry. Finally she called the huntsman and said, take the child into the forest, for I will endure no longer in my sight. Kill her and bring back her heart as proof. What a horrible person. The huntsman obeyed and led the child away. But when he had drawn his knife, Snow White began to cry. So would you, if you saw somebody coming at you with a knife ready to cut your heart out. The huntsman took pity on her because she looked so lovely and said, "Run away then, poor child, run away." As he returned to the castle, the huntsman came upon a bear, which he killed, and then removed its heart. That was handy. And brought it back to the queen, who laughed wickedly when she saw it. "Ah," she said, believing it to be Snow White's. It was a barefaced lie. The poor child was now all alone in the forest, and she felt frightened, and she looked at all the leafy trees around her. She didn't know what to do, so she began to run over sharp stones and through the thorns. Wild animals passed close to her, but did not harm her. She ran along as fast as her feet would carry her. When evening closed in, she saw a little house and went into it to rest. Everything in the house was very small. There stood a little table covered with a white tablecloth, on which were 7 little plates, each little plate with its own little spoon. Also 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little cups. Round the walls stood 7 little beds close together, with sheets as white as snow. Snow White was hungry and thirsty, so she ate a little bit of the vegetables and the bread on each plate, and she drank a little bit from every cup, not wishing to finish any meal entirely. Then, being very tired, Snow White lay down on one of the beds, but she could not make herself comfortable, for one was too long, another too short. The 7th, luckily, was just right, so there she stayed, said her prayers, and fell fast asleep. When it had grown quite dark, home came the masters of the house, 7 dwarfs, who mined for iron among the mountains. They lighted their 7 candles, and as soon as there was light in the kitchen, they saw that somebody had been there. The first said, "Who's been sitting on my stool?" The second, "Who has eaten off my plate?" The third, "Who has taken part of my loaf?" The fourth, "Who has touched my vegetables?" The fifth, "And who used my fork?" And the sixth, "And who has cut with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has drunk out of my cup?" The first dwarf looked about and saw that there was a slight hollow in his bed, and he asked, "Who's been lying on my little bed?" And the others came running out, and they all called out, "Somebody has been on my bed too." But the 7th, when he looked at his bed, saw Snow White there fast asleep. He called the others, who flocked around with cries of surprise. They fetched their 7 candles and cast the light on Snow White. "What a lovely child!" they cried. The 7 dwarfs were so pleased that they couldn't wake her up. But let her sleep there on the bed. The 7th dwarf slept in with the others in turn, an hour with each, so they spent the night that way. When it was morning, Snow White woke up and was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs. They were very friendly, however. "What is your name?" they asked. "Snow White," she answered. "Have you found your way to our house further?" asked the dwarfs. So she told them that her stepmother had tried to kill her, and the huntsman had spared her life, and how she'd run the whole day through until at last she found their little house in the woods. Then the dwarf said, "If you will look after our house, you may stay here with us." "Willingly," said Snow White. And so it was agreed that is what would happen. When they left for the mine the next morning, the good dwarfs warned Snow White. "Beware of your wicked stepmother," they said. "She may soon find out that you are here. Don't let anyone in, and don't talk to anyone. Don't let anybody in the house." The queen was back in the castle, and she'd no doubt that she was again the fairest woman in the world. She was a bit conceited. She walked up to the mirror and asked, "Little glass upon the wall, who is the fairest amongst us all?" The mirror replied, "Lady Queen, so grand and tall, here you are, the fairest of them all. But over the hills with the 7 dwarfs old lives Snow White, fairer 100-fold." The queen trembled with rage, knowing that the mirror never told a lie, never told a falsehood. So Snow White was still alive. "Ha! Snow White shall die," she cried, "if it cost me my own life." Then she went to a secret and lonely chamber where no one ever disturbed her. For hours she stayed there, making a poisoned apple. Ripe and rosy it was indeed, a beautiful sight to see, but it brought death to any who should eat it. So, anyway, would you like to see Snow White? There she is. She's having a nice little rest, and she's surrounded by the 7 dwarfs. See? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And Snow White is asleep in the bed. Anyway, when the apple was ready, the queen painted her face, disguised herself as a peasant woman, and travelled over the 7 hills to where the dwarfs lived. At the sound of a knock, Snow White put her head out the window and said, "I cannot open the door to anybody. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me to do so."
"Very well," replied the peasant woman. "I only want to be rid of my apples. Here, I will give you one, my child."
"I dare not take it," said Snow White.
"Afraid of being poisoned?" asked the old woman. "Look here, I will cut the apple in two, and you shall eat the rosy side, and I shall eat the white."
Now the fruit was so cleverly made that only the rosy side was poisoned. Snow White longed for a pretty apple, and when she saw the peasant woman eating it, she stretched out her hand and took the poisoned half. No sooner had she tasted it when she fell lifeless to the ground. The queen laughing loudly, "Ah ha ha ha!" Where's she? "Ah ha ha ha!" And she watched for a moment, and then she dashed away. And when she asked the mirror at home, "Little glass upon the wall, who is the fairest among us all?" the mirror at last replied, "Lady Queen, so grand and tall, you are the fairest of them all." Some more coffee.